jumping into the Old Testament and a book often referred to as the Book of Wisdom, but it sits in a collection of wisdom literature in the Old Testament. Joining us on the program now, a specialist in Old Testament study at Laidlaw College, Dr. Jong. John, kia ora, good morning.
Kia ora, Andrew. Kia ora to the listeners.
Proverbs is the wisdom book, and honestly, if you read through it, often you go, oh gosh, yeah, that makes sense. That seems like an appropriate way to live. You do this thing, you don't do that thing. Although some of it, honestly, I have to say, is either lost in translation or lost in the vast chasms of time between when it was written and now. You go, oh God, that's a bit of a curly one. What's your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Proverbs are a fascinating form of literature because, I mean, they're known. We're talking about Proverbs, talking about the proverbial sayings within the book of Proverbs, because
Okay.
the whole book of Proverbs does not only contain Proverbs, it's the key.
Mm-hmm.
The first 9 chapters of the book has almost no Proverbs, right?
Yeah.
Even though it begins with the title, The Proverbs of Solomon. The first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs is all about a father cajoling his child, his son, to convince him to seek wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
right? And those are really interesting chapters, but actually the purpose of those chapters is so that we will read the proverbial sayings themselves, which begin in chapter 10.
That's kind
That
of
is
just a
how we get the wisdom.
It's kind of just a warm-up, basically. It's saying, hey, if you've read this far, then take notes, pay attention, because this is solid advice on how to live. And I love the format of it, that it has, it goes in 2 parts. It is poetic in its style. It's got some balance to it. Do this,
Yeah,
don't do that,
yeah.
and yeah, really, really powerful. And was this originally poetic? Was this a form of poetic
Yeah.
literature?
So Proverbs, in every language and every culture has them.
Hmm.
And the magical thing, they're magical in as much as they're deeply rooted in the culture, which is your previous comment, Andrew, is some of them are like, wow, something's lost in the transmission
Yeah.
of 2,000 years, 3,000 years. Um, but Proverbs are by definition, they're punchy and they're memorable,
Hmm.
right? And that's how we remember them. Um, and deeply rooted in the culture in which they come from. But we've got to understand what Proverbs are. And to understand what they are, let's think about what they're not, proverbial saying. So they're not promises,
Mm.
they're not guarantees, and they're not rules,
Yeah.
right? And if we think of them in that way, we're going to be disappointed, or, sometimes Proverbs are used to bully people.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you think of them in those ways. Think of an obvious one that we can think of is Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the
Oh,
way he
yes.
should go,
Yeah.
and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. And yet, some children are brought up well, and yet they depart from following the Lord.
Hmm.
There's a reason for that. Even if the parents have done their job well, the child is also involved,
Yeah.
right? So it's not just as simple as we think. That proverb itself is, we could describe as generally true, because it generally is true.
Hmm.
Often proverbs are described like that, generally true, but that in fact is too general a way to describe all proverbs. In fact, many proverbs, even most proverbs, aren't general at all. And this is the key. Proverbs are very specific. So, a great book if you want to read on Proverbs, Dave Bland, his book on Proverbs.
Hmm.
And he uses a great description. He says, Proverbs are not floodlights, they don't illuminate all of life. Proverbs are spotlights, and they highlight one particular context or situation. And think of that in English. English proverbs, we have a proverb that says, fortune favors the bold.
Yeah.
We also say, look before you leap.
Yeah.
Right? So those are 2 proverbs which are, they can't be generally true in the sense of being true all the time
Hmm.
because they're opposite. The book of Proverbs itself famously has a similar pair of proverbs. So do you remember that one, Andrew? Proverbs 26:4
Yeah.
says, do not answer a fool according to his folly,
Oh, yes.
or you yourself will be just like him.
Hmm.
And the very next proverb says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes.
It's interesting
So,
that they're back to back there, and it does give you that moment of, hang on a minute, which one should I go for? Well, that depends on the context, right?
and that depends on the wisdom.
Oh, yes.
So the wisdom is knowing which proverb, which proverbial saying, which and then behavior that comes from that applies to the specific context. And we can think of that one. Don't answer a fool according to his folly. You'll be just like him. There's times we shouldn't answer, right?
Yeah.
And we think of that especially in our day and age, and think of social media and so on. I mean, but there's other times where the proverb says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. There's times when we have to answer.
Yeah.
So the wisdom is knowing when, which situation. So yeah, those are good examples. Just briefly, the purpose of the Proverbs. Just want to read Proverbs 1:1-3.
Yeah.
This is the outset, laying out why. So Proverbs 1, verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity. So Proverbs are very community focused, and that Proverbs are there to help us discern how to live well as God's people, and the behavior that God wants. So, I mean, you see, I'm a fan of Proverbs.
Yeah.
And as I said at the outset, they're misunderstood. And so we don't really read them, and the church doesn't read them much. I ask my students every year, how often do you have preaching on Proverbs? Well, never, or hardly ever, right? So how do we access them? That's the question. So if we read a chapter in Proverbs in our devotional reading, let's say, it's different than reading a chapter from a narrative section, from the Gospels, from the Psalms, because every single proverb is in and of itself a self-contained literary unit.
Yeah.
So you read 30 of them, by the end of the chapter, you're thinking, what did I just read? It's like a jumble of sayings, right?
Yeah.
Now, here's the magic. Because Proverbs are contextual, and because our own situation is constantly changing, different proverbs will apply to us at different times. So here's a great strategy for reading Proverbs. Okay, when you're reading the Bible in a year comes up and you're reading the chapter of Proverbs or whatever. Okay, read the chapter. Now, as you read, 1, 2, or 3 proverbs will stand out to you.
Yeah.
And the reason they will stand out, the reason they will speak to you is because of your situation, because Proverbs are so contextual. And so then make a note of the 1, the 2, the 3, then spend time after that meditating on those couple of proverbs.
That's a very good idea. And hey, next time you go through Proverbs, it may be different ones that stand out for you because life circumstances have changed. Yeah, it reminds me of, and hey, some people may be able to relate to this. I certainly can. Scrolling through memes on your social media feed. Some of them will be funny, and some of them you can't relate to. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that Proverbs is like a book of memes. That's tantamount to blasphemy there. But is that same type of thing that some things will relate to you, but there's wisdom for all of us in Proverbs, particularly if we apply it well.
Absolutely.
John, thank you so much for the work that you do at Laidlaw, laidlaw.ac.nz. For more information, if you're potentially considering study, a good place to start, laidlaw.ac.nz. John, thanks so much for what you do. Thanks for joining us.
Kia ora, thank you, Andrew. Kia ora, everyone.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.